Hey, and welcome to Matt and Jess TV. I am Matt Roast.
And I am Jessica Bun Bun.
This is our Dexter Original Sin Season 1, Episode 6 reaction and review, in which the show continues to just slowly and agonizingly get us closer to an answer that I don't know when they're actually going to reveal who the big bad is of this season.
I know. I mean, in the OG Dexter, they've played around with both, where they've kind of middle of season let you know who it is, but I mean, sometimes it is a bit later.
Yeah.
That first season with Brian, I mean, they didn't really come about that reveal until like episode 9 or 10 or something.
It's crazy because we've both been rewatching season 1 as of late, and I'm kind of in the midst of rewatching. I think I'm on episode 7 or episode 8, and they still haven't really revealed everything yet. And this has been a major shock to my system because I think sort of retroactively I convinced myself that they revealed Brian was the ice truck killer in episode 4 or something, and I'm just sitting here and being like, they still haven't done this yet? Like, what's going on?
I know.
It works well, though, for this season because it is sort of resetting my expectations and being like, okay, they clearly want us to think about a wide array of different possibilities here.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely leading us down one path with what has happened to the judge's son, what has now happened to Aaron's son. The Force is very focused only on one organization and nothing else. They are not really looking outside of that at this point. And for anyone who has watched the OG Dexter, it's always a red herring. And if you're new to it, it is definitely a red herring. It is not who they think it is.
Yeah, I mean, let's just all be real here for a moment. If this is a member of this organization that they've been looking into, that's just kind of boring. It's just there's nothing charismatic or interesting like that. Every single season of the original Dexter and even New Blood, there's always a central figure who is interesting and dynamic and wicked, and it's somebody who you really want to root against. Like, this is not a show that's just gonna have a generic baddie. I mean, if they have a generic baddie, I will sit here in a video later this season booing the show for doing that.
The biggest issue that I'm having is that they just didn't give us enough time with Aaron. I know that there's lots of people out there that were thinking like, maybe it's Aaron that's behind all this. And now that his son has been taken, it feels like it's not Aaron, but I would have liked to have felt a lot more about this. And I think if they had given us more time with Aaron to get to know Aaron, whether we like him or we don't like him, he's barely been on the show like Sarah Michelle Gellar. And because I haven't had enough time to really dive into this character, now that his son is taken, you know, I feel bad that his son is taken, but I don't feel as bad as I could have.
Well, we'll get more into that. There are plenty of fiery Dempsey takes as we go on here. But before we do, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We just made it over 68,000 subscribers here at the channel. We are so excited and grateful and happy. I mean, we've been doing this for years, and it's just really cool that people have come aboard, like what we're doing, and want to stick with us. But that's just a great way to make sure you don't miss any of the rest of our Dexter Original Sin coverage. If you did not know, we are also covering Dexter Resurrection later this year. Production on that just started, so we are really ramped up for that.
We are also covering Silo right now, and we've got Severance starting next week, next month. We got Yellow Jackets. There is so much going on. White Lotus. Hit that subscribe button and stick with us.
Okay, Patrick Dempsey. Not all of this is your fault. I will say that at the start. I did say earlier on this show that you think you're in Miami Vice, that you're a bad guy on that show. You are cranking it to 12 every single scene you're in. I think that's part of the problem, though, when it goes into what you're talking about when not really getting to know Aaron. And this is not all on Dempsey. I think some of it's on the writing that has just basically dictated that almost every single time we have seen this character, he's yelling at somebody. He's either yelling at people in Miami Metro. He's got a pretty difficult relationship, as it seems. He's just always upset. He's never been vulnerable before this episode. And now that he's vulnerable, he's also just yelling all the time. So it's just like there's no light and shade to this character at all.
I will say that it was good to learn
Yeah.
that about his wife and what had happened, and that she was with somebody else on the side for like 14 years. It was a really long time. I mean, that's something that would break the hardest of people, I feel. If
Yeah.
you really love somebody, you're with somebody, you're married to somebody, that's a very long time to be betrayed when you think that everything is fine. It was the bit of insight that I did need into him to kind of have a better understanding of why he is so jaded, why he doesn't
Yeah.
care about anything, why he's just so hard in the way that he is. But to see his son be taken and see what's coming out with his grief, I mean, he's angry, he's upset, he doesn't know what to do, he feels helpless. This was a great episode for him. I haven't, kind of cared either way about Aaron this season because I just haven't had enough of him, to be honest. This episode really did help with that. And I just wish that they had done some of this earlier on so that when we get to his son being taken, I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my God.
I think it all does set up here, and I'll put on a tinfoil hat as to
Okay.
how we end up losing Aaron at some point along the way.
Oh
Because
no.
Dempsey, I mean, he's not around in the original show. So
No.
there's obviously something that happens that gets him away from Miami Metro early enough that Dexter and nobody else on the original show talks about him. I mean, they talk a lot about Captain Matthews, who has
Yep.
not even been a part of this show yet, but they never talk about him. So what I think is going to happen here, and understandably so, I mean, the motivation is clearly there for him to flip out, is that he is going to try to go full Liam Neeson at some point in the next couple of episodes. He's already completely out of control. I mean, they should not have let him come anywhere near to this case at this point, to be honest. Like, why is he even in those rooms when it is his son? You know he's not going to be able to handle it. That's just like police 101.
100%. But there's no way that they're going to take him off this case. He's not going to allow that to happen. And I understand.
Yeah.
My son has been taken, then I am also not going to be off the case. You're going to have to pull me out of there. You can't just tell me to go home. You can't just tell me to sit down, be off the. No, it's not happening.
Everything he does here is going to be completely justified, but at the same time, whatever he does here is probably going to end up getting him fired and taken off the force because he's probably going to break a million different rules. Once again, understandably so, but I just think this is going to be the way they have to get Patrick Dempsey off the show. And it would make more sense that it happened this way than some sort of other ridiculous circumstance, like there's some bizarre incident that happens later that he's mixed up in, or he's a bad cop or something like this. It's like, okay, you've already set it up.
Yeah, for sure. I think if there was like some crazy twist or something that had happened, it turns out Aaron's really the bad guy.
Yeah.
This would have been talked about on the OG series for sure. I mean, that's a huge thing that would have happened in the department.
Yeah.
And it's only like 12 years later or whatever it is on the OG series. I think Dexter is 32 in the OG series. So over that time, I feel like if it was like, oh my goodness, someone who is running this department is actually the killer,
Yeah.
that would never not be talked about. It would be talked about till the end of time.
For sure.
But let's talk about Nikki, who is Aaron's son, who's been taken.
Yeah.
And he's locked up in the same room as the judge's son. They have a timeline here where, he's taken. 4 days later was a finger. 12 days later, he was on display. So they know that the timing of this is very, very short. So let's talk about who's behind this, because they
Okay.
think that it's the organization behind it that's like, oh, the judge has been coming down really hard on them. Aaron's been coming down really hard. And there's a reason why, and that's the connection. They're just jumping straight to it. And it makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
why would you really be looking that far out of the box? However,
Yeah.
it's not them. I mean, the people that we've seen on the show, there's not that many suspects here. I mean, for a while, a lot of us thought maybe Aaron, and there was a weird relationship going on with Clark where people were like, maybe it's Clark.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think it's Clark either. There's still Tanya. Could be Tanya, it's possible. But I still think it's Brian Moser, who we saw really early on this season, this tall, dark haired, looks exactly like Brian Moser from the OG series, asking to have a seat with Dexter or take his seat. Is this seat taken? He was there for a reason. He looks exactly like Dexter's brother. And there's so many similarities to what Brian did that's happening now. You have Nikki and the judge's son are being held in what looks like a shipping container. Like it's not, because we've seen that there's hallways and stuff, but that's what it looks like. And we know that Dexter and Brian were both in this shipping container in a similar type environment when they watched their mom die. So it's not surprising that then this would be the kind of environment where they're kind of locked up in what feels and looks like a canister. We know that he's cutting off the fingers. I mean, this is something that both brothers do. Dexter takes people apart later on, and we also know that Brian takes people apart. So there is a lot more similarities. I know that Brian wasn't sort of hunting or targeting people who were like really young. He had a much different MO with who he targeted later on. However, he feels like he's still very early on in the process. If you don't know the OG series, Brian was put into an institution for many years, and he didn't get out of there until he was like a young adult, kind of around now. So, I mean, it would make sense then that this is his first opportunity to start, looking for his brother. He has said that he looked for his brother for a really long time. It's possible that he found him. Dexter might be the only person he's looking at. He might be one of many people that he's looking at, and he's feeling out the waters. But if he's sort of like a brand new killer on the scene, he might be trying to figure out what his thing is. It was brought up in this episode with the case of the week that they were looking at, where it was like Dexter was like, oh, there's these 3 different murders and I think they're all connected, and Maria's like, yeah, but none of this MO makes any sense. And Dexter said this might be a fledgling killer who is trying to figure it out, and I don't think that that's a coincidence.
No, it's not. If we are to look at all the evidence that you've laid out here, plus what we know about the original show, Brian by far makes the most sense. And I think it would be kind of interesting if this entire show goes through this season and we actually don't have Miami Metro catch the person responsible. And maybe Dexter knows that that's not the person responsible, but nobody will listen to him.
Well, that's the other thing about Brian in the original series. He set up other people to take the fall. So him sort of as a fledgling killer and kind of trying to lead people onto another path, this is part of his MO and something that he does. Somebody actually left a really interesting comment here for us. I think it was on our last video, being like, Brian Moser's spinoff? And I'm here for that. I would absolutely watch a Brian Moser origin story. He was such an interesting character. I'd always felt like I wish they hadn't killed him off so early on in the series. He's just so good.
I just wish that we had seen more of him in season 1 now that I'm rewatching it, just because we have, Dexter's brother. We have a very interesting, complicated character here, and maybe there will be an opportunity to see more of him down the road on Original Sin, depending on kind of sort of how all of this plays out.
Well, the biggest question here, I've got this for you too, is if, for the people who haven't watched the OG, who here is actually a suspect at this point if it's not the organization?
That's what I think is a really big problem that the show has right now, because we can sit here and talk about Brian until our voices die out, but realistically, on the actual show right now, they have never mentioned his name in the present as anything. The guy we saw in the restaurant in episode 2, who we are convinced is Brian,
it's him.
Yeah, it's him, but the show has never said that it's him. So that creates all sorts of just chaos and confusion there. Because if we are just to look at this show at face value here, I find it incredibly hard to believe that Aaron would kidnap his own son. And with the way in which Dipsy's freaking out over all of it, don't see it. There's not a lot of other characters who we've met who would kind of fit or make sense. I watched the scene in which we saw Nikki be taken a number of times, and unless Sarah Michelle Gellar has pulled out the keyboard and started to sing the Jenna Marbles I Want to Be Tall song. She is not that tall. She is very small. I mean, sure, they can have it be unmasked that it's Buffy somehow later on this season and try to explain it. It just doesn't make any sense based on who we saw. And I have been at the top of the list of the Sarah Michelle Did It fan club for the majority of this season. It's just, we have to look at what we're actually seeing. And whoever was doing this to Nikki early on in this episode, they seemed like it was, I mean, you could say it could be a man or a woman still, but it was somebody who was tolerant, somebody who was, strong and athletic enough to move pretty quickly in that situation. And it's just, there's not a lot of suspects. And sure, you could introduce a really good guest star in the final few episodes of this season and have that work. I mean, we've been talking about Brian. We didn't see Brian on the original until kind of later on. It ended up working just fine. So you can still do that. But I just want it to be somebody we've already known because I want to feel like I have been hoodwinked and led astray. That's just so much more fun.
Now, here is a theory that I've seen a lot of you guys leave in the comments. So credit to all of you who left this. I've seen it like 10 or 20 times now. The idea that Tanya is the person who is training Brian, and that's how there is a connection between Tanya and Brian, why we don't have Tanya later on in the OG series for whatever reason, that she's gone off to do whatever. Maybe she thinks the heat's getting too hot and she goes to retires, do something else. But then that would explain then why the build doesn't match up, but how Tanya might be still involved.
I like that. It's a fun theory, and it's also a way in which where if they need to write Sarah Michelle Gellar off, at some point they're going to have to. She's listed as a special guest star, and just like with Spencer, they never mention her on the original show, so she can't be around that long. The most compelling idea, if we're to go down this line of thinking, is that Brian eventually takes her out himself and is just like, I got to make sure there's nobody who is tied to me, who can identify me, and this is a great way in which to make that happen.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's a lot of our suspicion about what's going on all of that. Now, I just want to take a moment to revel in one of my favorite things on Dexter, and I've mentioned this in past videos. Dexter dating, or Dexter being around women, is the funniest thing I have possibly ever seen. The entire dating sequence where he orders so much food. I was jealous of his metabolism in that moment.
His social etiquette is just terrible.
No.
It's so bad, but it's so funny to watch.
It is so funny to watch. Everything with the dating sequence, him not knowing what to do. The only time he even seems like remotely romantic is when he is teaching Sophia how to throw the dart, which he learned because he was studying how to take out Levi. There's also a very bizarre season 1 Easter egg in the midst of all of this, without getting into too many specifics for obvious reasons. When Sophia and Dexter are in the bathroom and she decides to, let's just say, go for it in that moment, we have this line from Dexter, the narrator, about his reaction to that moment. And it is the exact same line, basically, that he says when Rita in season 1 decides to go for it. I was just like, oh, I see what you guys are doing. Dexter has a very similar sentiment to this in both shows.
They also had another really nice Easter egg about the bowling when Sophia's like, hey, do you want to see me again tomorrow? And he's like, no, I can't. I'm bowling. And she's like, what are you, like a 40-year-old? You're bowling? In the OG series, he had a league with his co-workers called Bowl Till You Bleed. And he used that bowling league a lot to be able to go and do what he does.
Yeah, I think Clyde Phillips is having a good time.
I'm having a good time. I love it.
It's just, there's a lot of care that is being put into this show. And that's why I think that everything we're seeing is happening for a reason. And if I'm being honest, if we're going down this line of logic with Brian, as you've suggested, that would be one of the only things that would justify the insane amount of time we're spending on these flashbacks. It's like, okay,
Yes.
I will understand it a lot more if this is sort of what we're setting up here, because otherwise it just doesn't have that much of a connection at all to what's happening in the quote unquote present of this show, because we already know that Harry has Dexter. We don't really need that much more backstory on just like that one thing alone.
Beep, bop, boop. Let's go back into the past here, and we're going to
Oh boy.
talk about these flashbacks. So we have, after learning that his wife is pregnant, Harry is continuing on his affair with Laura all the way till
Yeah.
Deb's birth. Like, it feels very much like he's in love with her. Like, it's not just an affair anymore. It's not just a fun time anymore. Like, the scenes between them felt very much like he's in love with her. But once Deb is born, it's over. His wife's like, no, I know about this. I know it's been going on a long time now, but now that your daughter's here, it's done. You're going to end it. And he's like,
Yeah.
okay, I promise that I will. And it feels also like it's leading up to losing Laura anyways. I mean, she's been promoted
Yeah.
in what's going on. She doesn't want to be part of it anymore. She's begging Harry to get her out of it. And he's like, no, you're almost there. You're almost there. I feel like we're going to get to the end of the season where Laura is gone.
Yeah.
And we're going to have that big scene where Harry rushes into the canister, takes out Dexter, and we see that Brian is there.
It feels like that is how this is all being set up here. And yeah, we got snippets of this in season 1, so it's not covering like the most new ground
No, it's not.
at all. But if you are connecting it to everything in the present here with Brian, I think you can find a
Or
way.
spinoff.
Whatever it may be, you can find a way to make it at least make a certain element of sense and not just make it feel like we're just wasting our time because they needed to fill up all these episodes, because that is my, hard hat, face of disappointment, worst case scenario for what's going on here.
All right, let's talk about Levi and everything that happened there. This is his third kill. He's reached a milestone, and it's a really important milestone to him. And, it's somebody that he's been trying to get for quite a few episodes now.
Yeah.
He finally has him back of the trunk, headed out to feed him to the alligators because he does not know that one hand has popped up. He gets there. There's cops everywhere that are like, sir, you can't be here. This is a active crime scene. Tinfoil hat, and I don't think it's too much of a tinfoil hat. I think he's just going to be turned away, that they're not going to search his truck. They're just going to be like, this is an active crime scene, kid. Like, you're 20 years old. Turn around, get out of here, go home. And he's going to go home with a body in the trunk and be like, nah, I don't know what to do anymore.
That's probably how all this is going to go. It's really weird to come out of this episode with a cliffhanger like this, because it's not even really a cliffhanger. Like, we know that Dexter's not going to be found out. So there's no real suspense here. I mean, the only real question is, okay, how is he going to get out of this? And sometimes the most obvious answer is the right answer, and it's probably not going to be that complicated. I mean, sure, you could kind of come up with some situation where maybe things are taking a really long time and he calls Harry and Harry shows up and helps, but it's just like, okay, none of that needs to happen. All that needs to happen is just that he's told to go away. What he will obviously learn from all of this, and I would be just as surprised to learn this, Dexter. Not that I'm doing any of the terrible things you're doing, but it's just, you can't expect the Gators to do all of your dirty work.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because as Matt said, we're rewatching the first season, and there is a line from Masuka at one point in the OG series where him and Dexter are talking about, like, if we were going to get rid of somebody, how would we do it? And this is where Masuka is in. The first thing he says is Gators.
I'm sure now when you play it back, Dexter's in his head is like, ha, 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 ha.
I know that doesn't work.
Yeah, the part of this that's going to be interesting, I guess, from moving forward is that we know at some point Dexter has his boat, slice of life, you know, he takes everybody out in the garbage bags, but it's, how much money is this dude making right now at Miami Metro? I don't know if he's at the I can buy a boat stage of his career.
No, he's not. He's an intern. But by the time he's got a boat. I mean, he is living in an apartment and he is doing apartment living. So he might be sort of in that situation where he's like, I'd rather not own a house. I'd rather have a boat. So I'll rent, which is, maybe cheaper at that point to be like, okay, well, I don't have a mortgage or property taxes or anything like that. I'll rent this apartment and put my money into my boat because my boat is more important than where I live at this point.
Yeah, it's something that they're going to have to explain, obviously, at some point.
I would like to think that after 12 years, he'd be making some decent money there. I mean, that's a long time to put into a job to
Yeah.
like be broke.
Yeah, there's got to be Dexter. Let us see your financials. Can we be your bookkeepers?
Let's also talk about Gio because this was the first time I think we're all suspicious
Yeah.
of Gio that he's not a good dude. And this is the first time that we saw him really lose his cool at the bar where somebody had, knocked into Deb,
Yeah.
spilled the drink, whatever. It's something that seems to happen on shows all the time. And he took it to an 11 for no reason. I mean, this guy was like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. This was just a mistake. It wasn't on purpose. I'm not here to be a jerk or do something here. It's crowded. What do you want me to do? And he lost his mind.
There's one of two things that are happening here. One, Gio just has an anger problem, and that's just going to be a relationship issue that causes him to break up. But that's honestly a little bit more boring than what I think this show would want to do, which is that Gio is working for maybe perhaps the same organization we've been talking about this whole time, and that he is having to go undercover so that if they need to use Deb at some point as leverage down the road, whether they take her or something else, they can. But maybe then Gio's having some anger problems here because he's struggling being undercover and he's just frustrated, and all this is coming to the surface at this one particular moment.
For everyone who's watched the OG version, we know what happens with Deb and the ice truck killer. I don't want to watch a repeat of that.
Mhm.
That basically this same thing happens to her when she's a teenager, and then the same thing happens to her 12 years later.
I think they have to find some sort of middle ground with it, because
Yes.
I want there to be a situation where we're looking at somebody in Gio who's more than just like a prototypical weird bad boyfriend. And
Creep.
I want there to be something more here that pays off. But yeah, I don't want to watch the same exact thing again either. So I think there might be a way where some of this is figured out before that actually happens to Deb, or there's some
Yeah.
other sort of standoff that ends up happening. Maybe Dexter ends up taking out Gio himself.
I just feel like if Deb ends up getting taken or something like that happens, that would have come up in the OG series as well after what happened with Brian. That she'd be like, cool, this is the second time that something like this has happened to me. Or it would have brought up feelings of what happened to her when she was this age. And now she's like, oh my God, why does this keep happening to me? This is, not the first time.
Writing for Original Sin has to be sort of like you're fighting a boss in Elden Ring, and you have to know when to dodge because the sword is coming at you. And so they're constantly having to dodge all these different guardrails of like, okay, we can't allow this strike to hit us because then the original show doesn't make sense. We got to constantly weave around all. It's not easy, especially when we are all out here so active and ready to point out all the inaccuracies that they may throw at us, and we've already done that sometimes this season already.
Yeah, there's been a little bit, but I think that overall this show has done a fairly good job keeping up with the original
Yeah.
and not taking anything away from it. As we're rewatching it, I mean, I can't speak for you, but for me, I haven't really seen a lot where I'm just like, oh, this is, doesn't make sense with what's going on with Original Sin. Like, yeah, the Dexter on Original Sin as like a little
Yeah.
kid is a little bit older, but so much older that I'm like, I don't know. Like rewatching it, I'm like, oh yeah. So he was about 3 and he has some memories. He remembered his brother. It was just a lot of stuff he had put away locked in his memory because he didn't want to remember, but he did have memories. The biggest one that I just had the problem with is that he would remember Harry being there
Mhm.
this much. At the very least, he's there for 9 months through that entire pregnancy. And we know that he was there for longer than that. So he's going to be in Dexter's life for this long, and Dexter's not going to remember that he was there.
That's weird. That's the biggest thing that's
He drew a
weird.
picture of him.
Yeah, they're doing, I think, a reasonably good job, but everything with that part of the story, I'm struggling to line up a little bit.
Yeah.
But in general, I'm having a good time with Original
Yes.
Sin. And, I wish it was longer than, a 10 episode show here, but we will be back with more discussion about the show. So hit that subscribe button so you do not miss that. Also, as Jess pointed out, Severance is about to premiere. We are really excited to get into that. And you can support us further by joining our Patreon. We have a link in the description below there. We have a new exclusive video review there of the first 2 episodes of The Pit, a new medical drama on Max starring Noah Wiley. Really good discussion. I highly suggest you check that out. Thank you so much to our patrons. We'll see you here next time.